Hello everyone, today we talk about the Herring of the North, one of the most traumatically brutal chapters in high medieval warfare, yet also a great display of civilization and political success in Northern Europe at this stage of, in fact, the expansion of the great Franco-Roman, essentially French papal tradition that in the 11th century had been striking success after success. If you're interested, I have an entire playlist dedicated to the 11th century as a whole. Very complex time. Although I have hundreds of videos now for every medieval century, especially from the high to the later, it's very difficult to provide with a comprehensive explanation of how big the affirmation of Western Christendom was at this point, right? Because the peak was actually during the 12th, the 13th, in particular, the early 14th, but the foundations led in the 10th, and the initial expansion of the 11th is really something enormous. And it's really important to frame the Norman conquest of, not even of England, but of Britain, as a matter of fact, just as much as the English had always, with the Breth Valda, in fact, conceived their right to rule over the Celtic fringe, really not just started one of the most successful cultures, so to say, and sort of polities and institutional tradition in the history of the world, not just of the West. I mean, it is of the West of the world, but quite much if you consider the English future in a also quite directly global sense. Naturally much later, but still, right, seminally speaking. But it was also part, in fact, of a massive resystematization of Western Eurasia. And I'm not actually going too far with this. Naturally, the Norman conquest of England was something sort of much more contingent to Northwestern Europe and so on, but it was still part, in fact, of a much bigger picture of Latin Germanic reinforcement, acculturation, consolidation, and especially expansion. Right? It's naturally very difficult and provoking, by the way, to offer this narrative for such a bloody, violent picture of like the herring of the North's one. However, there is surely some didactic lesson to draw from this, and we will get a bit more into it, because also I think we haven't made so many videos about medieval England as we should. I think like we made 60 or something. I don't know, Germany, France have more than 100. Italy, I think even 200. However, we'll get more in depth in this period because it's really much more important than even sort of naturally the Anglo-centric centrality of Hastings, for, allow me this game of words, would actually portray, right? Much more important as well. In fact, it's what happens later, right? It's not like things were simply settled at Hastings. In fact, the Norman victory in the aforementioned battle on October the 14th, 1066, last year I made a video about the times and meaning of Hastings. You can check out, and we'll make at some point probably a tactical analysis reconstruction. Naturally, we will not add who knows what in terms of originality, because it's such a hyper-studied battle, and we don't even have that much about the actual tactics, deployment, and so on. And there is more room for interpretation, maybe in that sense, but still, the importance lays, in fact, in the broader background of this. Right? What did really substantiate at Hastings on October the 14th of 1066, a battle that proved crushing in a such clear fashion, outcome-wise, and so that in the immediate sense effectively destroyed the Anglo-Danish resistance in a broader political sense, meaning the Kingdom of England at this point was properly conquered by William the Conqueror, but England as a whole, in part also Britain, there were also some foreign actors that tried to roll backward, was not yet fully subjugated, tamed, which is no joke, by the way, because the same Norman presence was threatened. As you know, we made also some videos about the Anglo-Saxons. We still have to cover, in particular, Wessex, but as we've seen with Mercia, that essentially the Anglo-Saxon world, as we call it, was importantly divided. All right, there was a north, broadly speaking. It could have encompassed also Mercia as the Midlands, as a sort of more tendentially continental, more archaic, primitive, traditional world. Then there was a Saxon south that was way more sort of advanced, modernized, secularized, very much influenced by the French. The reason why William the Conqueror could take over England was mostly because of the support of the Saxon establishment, at least an important part of the same. This is not the video in which we're going to discuss it, because we stick to the military side of the story to show you properly the concrete technicality of how the North was harried. However, and this is only the second video we make about William the Conqueror, and just indirectly I will have to make a biography, a military biography of him for obvious reasons, but there is in fact much more beyond also his times regarding, think about all the baronial rebellions, etc. It's always the same pattern. Half of the country against the more centralistic south, in this sponsored by also the Celtic fringe at some point, just as we've seen, for example, even before with the Battle of Brunanburh, the Gaelo-Norse, Anglo-Saxon, but Northumbrian hostility towards a unified kingdom. It was actually born in that battle, right? Properly the affirmation of a united control over England, more than nominally, as it had been for the case of the Berchtwald. I mean, over the entirety of Britain was established there, and it's relatively recent, right? It's just when you look at Hastings, the century before. It's really a very interesting history. We have to talk more about the Anglo-Saxon, the Anglo-Danish period as well. Now, Harold Godwinson lay dead upon the blood-soaked ridge of Senlac. His personal guard of huscarls was annihilated around him, and the greater part of the Anglo-Saxon feared scattered in panic across the Sussex Weald. We talked a bit about all of these guys, what their role was, both politically, military, socially. Harold's, for example, military experience in England, in Wales, in Normandy, the incredibly frightening nature of the huscarls. Some survivors fleeing to the Varangian Guard in Constantinople, some of them just to be killed at the Battle of Dyrrhachion a decade or so later. I made a video at the hands of the Siculo Normans. The Anglo-Saxon feared levy, its rota system, its select element as well, being probably the defining rank bulk of the Anglo-Danish forces, not just at Hastings, but in the 1066 campaign overall, as you know, with Harald Hardrada in the north, creating much issues, like probably being the tip of the balance in eventually causing the Anglo-Danish defeat against the Normans. There would be so much to say. This is a page of history. It lends itself to a lot of what-ifs, but I don't like what-ifs very much. I think that what happened is much more interesting, especially when you get beyond sort of the more flashy or famous episodes. After Hastings, the conquest of England was far from complete, and the submissions that followed at Berkhamsted in the chill of early December 1066 did not signal the end of opposition so much as a calculated interlude. And there, beneath the bare oaks of that Hertfordshire town, the young Edgar Etheling, grandson of Edmund Ironside, it was great-nephew of Edward the Confessor, and the last male heir of the ancient House of Wessex, thus knelt alongside the powerful Earls Edwin of Mercia and Morcar of Northumbria, together with Archbishop Eldred of York and a host of lesser thanes and churchmen. So these were in great part like the representatives of what was left of Anglo-Danish power in a establishment sense, right? They offered homage to William, Duke of Normandy, acknowledging him as king in a ceremony carefully staged to project the appearance of national consensus. Contemporary chroniclers, including the Anglo-Saxon one, in its various recensions, insist that England's true surrender occurred not amid the clash of arms at Hastings, but in this formal act of capitulation 2 months later. There is something very almost migration era to this, especially considering the further resistance that went on afterwards, because it's not just much a matter of conquering places and having, I don't know, it's going to happen later, I don't know, in Wales or in Ireland, or even more in Scotland, like some properly organized resistance that was more or less, say, put down with different outcomes, actually, with wars of Scottish independence going the other direction. But there were properly some traditional beliefs in these countries that had not yet properly framed under a sort of univocally stable and power-concentrated monarchy concerning the notion of who had actually been defeated. For example, we have seen that video of Frankish Longobard warfare, that is the Battle of the Livenza River. That was the last stand of the Longobard Austria, that is to say the northeastern Italian part of the kingdom that had not supported the last monarch Desiderius, that was defeated by Charlemagne in a great campaign that witnessed like the double crossing of the Alps, pincer movement, the siege of Pavia, etc., because they had basically not followed him, had been probably also part of his defeat, because he had been bought as a king before and so on, and they took their own stand, convinced that they were actually, at that point, the true Longobards of the story. And so, while Anglo-Danish England at this point was not really, say, provided with the same stately unitary physiognomy, the politically sort of cohesive physiognomy that even the late 8th century Longobard Kingdom of Italy could have, there is something even more sort of primitively heroic about the idea of saying, we will still basically fight and die. We'll stand our ground for the old order, hoping that something happens in the meanwhile, because it was technically possible that, a further invasion like the Norwegian one could happen again. There is all a military history, by the way, of later interventions of the Scandinavians into Britain. We've seen it, at least for Scotland, in the video about the Battle of Largs. So you could really never know. It was a greatly confused time. And as you understand here, the Anglo-Danish didn't much stand a chance, but it's not like they didn't try. And of course, before that, it was yet to be seen. And so, as all wars actually, if you fight, there is some concrete chance of making it. And how can you draw the line even? There is something very Anglo-Saxon in this, by the way, a sense of civil liberty, of an idea of rights that, even though archaically and in this high medieval Northern European context, can be found in some of the most spiritually ideal aspects of, common law and some Anglo-American trait, think about the right of bearing arms, fighting against tyranny, and so on. The pledges given at Berkhamsted rang hollow for most of the northern magnates, in fact, of all who bent the knee that they only Eldred, the aged prelate who had crowned Harold himself in January and would soon anoint William on Christmas Day of that same fateful 1066, maintain an unwavering loyalty to the new regime. In a sense, they needed that. There is also a traditional view of power as lordship, as far as the local population's right would be at least partially respected to the degree it was politically tolerable. As we explained before, England was not fully homogeneous regarding this, and there was actually much that the Saxon South in particular had to earn from being integrated in the great sort of Frankish world. Remember always that William's conquest was actually a papally blessed crusade, right, against the Anglo-Danes. The other magnates instead nursed grievances that would soon erupt into open rebellion, chief among them Edwin's frustration over a promised marriage to one of William's daughters that would naturally project him at the highest spheres, and also by inheritance, like who knows how far. A union dangled as bait, actually, to secure mercy and allegiance, but withheld, in fact, when Norman barons protested the risk of empowering a native rival. The north of England swiftly became the crucible of this lingering resistance. This vast and rugged territory, very, very complex, very, but also look at the time, like sort of much less, of course, deforested, cleared, bonified than today, like which we're looking more or less in the 11th century what encompassed the future counties of Yorkshire that had historically been a bit the center of dissent. The great spiritual soul of the north. I made a couple of months ago a video about Northumbria, and these places were the ones that had also at some point hosted the Vikings, as we said before, against the Anglo-Saxon south and so on. At that point was a shire far more extensive than its modern boundaries, as the Domesday Survey of 1086 would later delineate. I talked about, of course, the Domesday Book. We'll mention it later again, but again, I have a pretty hefty playlist about medieval English history. Durham and Northumberland along the eastern seaboard, where the Danelaw had sort of existed, together with Lancashire and the southern reaches of Cumberland and Westmoreland, to the west, forming a natural fortress against southern authority, historically, way before the Normans. Its inhabitants represented a distinctive Anglo-Scandinavian society, yet the product of 2 centuries of Viking settlement that had begun with the Great Eden Army of 865-866 at the time of Albert the Great, and so probably an idea of English monarchy that was sort of underway, if anything. And continued through the establishment of the Danelaw, the aforementioned Danelaw. Norse colonists had imposed their language, legal customs, and social structures upon an Anglo-Saxon substratum, creating a hybrid culture whose traces endured in everything from agricultural practices to personal nomenclature. I made a video about English and Welsh warfare because there is also made separated videos about Ireland and Scotland, and also the Northern Isles, as well as, by the way, about Scandinavia, about Northern France for that matter, where we explain essentially also after the final Norman conquest, it will illustrate now the persistence of some evident consonances, let's put it in this way, with certain traits of Scandinavian warfare, not much necessarily also connected on the surface in styles and more with Fennoscandia, but also and especially an expression of the local social-cultural characteristics. I mean, this scarce stratification, more reliance on infantry, for example, a bit like, again, in Scandinavia. In the south, things were really different. The Normans also were bringing from France really a much more advanced military and political institutional system and so on. It's not like the Anglo-Danes were particularly underdeveloped. This was a post-Roman world with some significant, at least tendentially unitary tradition. London, Westminster was much of a more an early capital than Paris, like with a stable chancery and so on. So it's naturally a smaller country. There are differences about this, but it also had some of the most advanced administrative systems. Surely in Northern Europe, it was the most advanced country, and it doesn't figure badly compared to the rest of history. There were great kings also from Scandinavia, such as Knut, that was a great king of England, or the English, actually, as it should be more properly said. We will, if anything, make a video about him soon, because it's such a great figure, and we have to talk more about the Viking here. This this world is really fascinating. And culturally, you can find characteristics like the dialect spoken in Yorkshire, for instance, that is still today very distinctive, incorporated numerous Old Norse loan words, terms like egg derived from the Scandinavian egg rather than the southern egg, or window from Vindauga, and sounded alien to ears accustomed to the speech of Wessex or Kent. Right today, it sounds, as far as I can understand, but I have heard, very much more similar to Scottish, but in fact also Scotland had been heavily affected, so to say, by Scandinavian raids, incursions, settlements. South of the River Tees, in the broad expanse that roughly corresponded to the historic heart of Yorkshire, many aristocratic families still traced their lineage to Danish settlers that had constituted historically the majority. Denmark was the most powerful in the Scandinavian country, the more sort of manpower loaded, the most developed in a probably also political military sense. We had received land grants under the peace settlements of the late 9th and early 10th centuries. As you know, the Anglo-Saxons had been obliged to broker deals with the Norse regarding their settlement because they couldn't simply dislodge them. The Danes had tried first with Gaul. In part, they had succeeded with the same Normans that at this point were French enough, so to say, at least Western Frankish. But in general, they didn't really break through more than much, and Britain had turned Ireland as well to one of the most lucrative lands of conquest for Nordic standards. Even the administrative divisions of the region reflected this Scandinavian heritage, while southern shires were subdivided into hundreds, penally. Northern equivalents often bore the Scandinavian term wapentake, evoking the weapon-brandishing assemblies of the Viking thing. Right, so literally, like the assembly bore the name of those who bear arms, like the populus, etc. Some sort of very migration era sounding, again, at a smaller scale in Scandinavia, but that you can find actually even among the Franks that had sort of here created even the Normans. Geographical isolation further entrenched the North's independence. Overland communication with the South was a laborious affair, hampered by dense forests, treacherous moors, and rivers prone to flooding. Think about this before we want to launch an invasion of that, but it's not like the Normans don't know their job, which is also the only thing they know in terms of war making. While the primitive state of the roads, little more than rutted tracks, really. There was just one main road from London to York, and then all the rest was pretty deteriorating in comparison, rendered wheeled transport impractical for much of the year. Thus, also prolonged campaign is something rather challenging. The Anglo-Danes in this had been really incredible in 1066, going back and forth across Britain to actually successfully dealing with the Norse invaders, and one of the greatest leaders, as you know, of the era, and then coming back still orderly as a cohesive mass and almost winning actually against the Normans at the Battle of Hastings. The preferred route for merchants, messengers, and armies traveling between York and London was by ship, by the way, hugging the coast or navigating the Amber estuary. A bit of a Scandinavian tradition there too of seafaring, but something that was connaturated to the Eastern Anglo-Saxons even before that. We've seen it in many videos. Now, this physical separation had long translated into political autonomy, at least to some degree. As early as 962, King Edgar the Peaceful, I made a video about him, about his reign, had granted the northern earls within the old Danelaw a measure of legal self-governance in exchange for their oaths of loyalty, a concession that effectively curtailed the authority of his Anglo-Saxon successors north of the River Humber. The earldom of Northumbria itself, a sprawling dominion that stretched from the Tees in the south to the Tweed in the north, functioned almost as a buffer state, its holders mediating between the English crown and the kings of Scots, while occasionally entertaining overtures from Scandinavian pretenders. Also, the Kingdom of England later have a a video in counting also about Swedish history, entertained quite interesting relations with the Scandinavians, even claimed at some point that they had a rightful claim to the rule of Norway, right? Never substantiated, but still, in part in this broader North Sea side sort of imperial ambition of, in fact, Viking vibes. Such structural weaknesses, however, the North overall made the region ripe for exploitation in the chaotic aftermath of Hastings. And it was a big place, so at least in absolute terms, you could really take a lot from it. And it was here, in fact, that Edgar Etheling's claim found its most fertile ground, drawing support from the dispossessed Anglo-Saxon Danes, Anglo-Scandinavian freeholders wary of Norman taxation, and even residual elements still sympathetic to Danish intervention, that realized that was essentially the only last standing landmass were to, in fact, put a resistance from against the Normans in any hopefully successful fashion. This was too much of a critical mass to be ignored. William's first attempts to impose order through native intermediaries collapsed with startling rapidity. In 1067, while briefly in England before returning to Normandy to consolidate his ducal authority, he appointed Copsey as Earl of Northumbria during a ceremony at Barking in Essex. Copsey was a calculated choice, a Northumbrian by birth, descended from the ruling house of Bernicia, whose ancestors relate in the far northeast. You see in the video about Northumbria, whose ancestors had dominated the sub-kingdom and at times the whole of Northumbria before the Danish conquest of the early 11th century. So a distinguished nobleman probably of Anglian ancestry. He had been a staunch ally of Tostig Godwinson during the latter's contentious tenure as Earl from 1055 to 1065. This was the brother of Harold that basically also sided with the North, made really a mess, right? A great part of he was a symptom, of course, of broader weakness, but let's say he caused most of the problems that followed this rule. Also, a period, by the way, marked by heavy taxation, favoritism toward Flemish retainers, and brutal suppression of local dissident that culminated in the York uprising of October 1065, which saw Tostig, in fact, expelled and replaced by Morkers. It's not, of course, like the Anglo-Danish were all that good, and there was a reason why the Normans thought that time was had come really to take over this fragile and stable country. Copsey had accompanied Tostig into exile in Flanders and then joined the Norwegian invasion under Harald Hardrada, fighting at the Battle of Stamford Bridge on September the 25th, 1066, where Hardrada and Tostig met their ends against Harold Godwinson's Huscarls. We'll talk about that soon because, as you know, I have a mini-series ongoing on Harald Hardrada. Surviving the rout, Copsey wasted no time in seeking accommodation with the victor, offering homage at Barking and receiving the earldom as reward. His tenure lasted a mere 5 weeks. On March the 12th, 1067, while traveling through his new domain, he was ambushed and murdered at Newburn upon Tyne by Osulf, son of Edwulf IV of Bernicia, a scion of a rival lineage whose father had been slain in 1041, resisting a Scottish incursion, as it was dreadfully typical on the northern frontier, especially in Bernicia. The killing was less a political statement than a settling of old blood feuds, but it underscored the volatility of northern loyalties. Osulf's usurpation proved equally brief. Later that autumn, while pursuing rebels in the forests near Bamberg, he fell victim to a band of outlaws, possibly hired assassins, though the sources are vague, and his corpse was left unburied as a warning. With the earldom vacant once more, William sold the title to Osulf's cousin, Cospatrick, a descendant of the formidable Uhtred the Bold, who had ruled Northumbria from 1006 until his murder 10 years later on Knut the Great's own orders. Cospatrick paid a substantial sum for the privilege, but his allegiance was opportunistic at best. By the summer of 1068, he had thrown in his lot with Edgar Atheling, coordinating raids and gathering forces in the Yorkshire hinterlands. The sequence of assassinations, purchases, and defections left William with little choice but to intervene in person. It was also a great occasion in casus belli. In the high summer of 1068, having already quelled stirrings in the Midlands, where Edwin and Morcar had briefly raised the standard of revolt, spurred by the stalled marriage negotiations and the encroachment of Norman castellans on Mercian estates, he marched north at the head of a substantial army. His advance was methodical, designed as much to intimidate as to engage. At every defensible river crossing, road junction, or naturally fortified hill, he ordered the rapid construction of motte-and-bailey castles, earthen mounds surmounted by timber palisades, and towers surrounded by ditches and outer baileys. There is an enormous historiographical debate, as you know, revolving around these fortifications, when they were actually built, how much did the Normans contribute to where. It's mostly an archaeological debate, right? In any case, here we are witnessing to the display of Western Frankish military superiority, military engineering, logistics, and the amount of resources that at this point, especially after Hastings, William could draw plenty from for the time standards from both Normandy and the Saxon south. These strong points served multiple purposes. They anchored supply lines, provided refuge for foraging parties, and projected an image of inexorable dominance. It was mostly a psychological imposition on the local populations that were now lorded over from this towering emplacements. As William approached York, the heart of northern resistance, opposition dissolved like mist before the sun. Edgar Atheling, Cospatrick, and their chief lieutenants fled across the border into Scotland, where King Malcolm III, himself no stranger to raiding Northumbrian territory, as we've seen also before, having sacked Lindisfarne as recently as 1061, offered them sanctuary and promises of future aid. It's obvious that there wasn't much of a cohesive resistance in this proper north, right? The power concentration in the south was too big. The problem now was winning over this enormous territory in a more direct way. Upon entering York, William orchestrated a carefully choreographed display of authority. Never been there, by the way. And the city's leading citizens presented him with the keys to its gates, a symbolic gesture of submission. Hostages were naturally taken from the surrounding countryside, sons of prominent thanes, guaranteed to ensure good behavior. And being co-opted also at the Norman court, that was very much sort of foreign to Anglo-Danish culture, especially that far north. Bishop Ethelwyn of Durham, a shrewd observer of the shifting winds, rode in to tender his allegiance and provided detailed intelligence on rebel movements and supply caches. To secure the city against immediate counterattack, William commanded the immediate raising of a motte-and-bailey hill, a steep natural escarpment overlooking the river Ouse to the south of the old Roman walls. Local labor was conscripted under Norman oversight, and within weeks a formidable earthwork rose, topped by a wooden tower and encircled by a palisade, its footprint still visible today beneath later medieval stonework. Diplomatic feelers were extended to Malcolm III, emphasizing mutual interest in border stability and implicitly threatening reprisals should Scottish soil continue to harbor English exiles. Scotland was very much anglicized, since in fact the Germanic invasion of Britain with the Normans, it will sort of go further. I made a video about Davidian Scotland for the following century. The north of Britain was naturally more unstable and less power concentrated. However, right, we're not talking as a whole of a small island, and in general, it is difficult. Like in other fringes, we've seen it, I don't know, in Spain, or even, I don't know, think about Brittany, that had partially participated actually to the Norman conquest. Direct control, especially where, in fact, institutions are already feeble, is sort of difficult without local surplus and so on. So there is mostly like a sphere of influence that gradually also contributes to the development of the local countries. Satisfied with these arrangements, William began his southward journey along the eastern route, proposing to fortify additional struggles along the same, which sounds very sound strategically speaking. Warwick Castle, entrusted to Henry de Beaumont, a trusted lieutenant from the Breton campaigns. Nottingham, overlooking the Trent and commanding the approaches to the Peak District. Lincoln, astride the Fossway, Huntington, and Cambridge. Each received a Norman castellan and a garrison drawn from William's continental veterans, men like William Paverel at Nottingham, whose loyalty had been proven in the ducal wars of the 1050s. There is all a Norman military history at some point. It's, again, with a good military biography of William, everything should be clear. The defection of Edwin and Morcar in the spring of 1068 injected fresh vigor into the northern cause. Having chafed under house arrest in the royal court and sensing the tightening news of Norman surveillance, the brothers slipped away under cover of darkness and made for York. There they linked arms with Cospatrick and secured an alliance with Blethyn ap Cynfyn, the resourceful king of Gwynedd, whose mountain warriors had long harassed the market lords along the Welsh border. The same Harold, as we were saying before, had been fighting in the Celtic fringe. This coalition aspired to more than local defiance. It was the repetition of a very well-known pattern in British history against the southern civilization. It aimed to ignite a national uprising, or actually multinational uprising, as you see here, coordinated with discontented elements in the West Country and the Fenlands as well. An army of several thousand Anglo-Saxon Thanes, Danish-descended freeholders, and Welsh auxiliaries marched south from York, intending to link with rebels in Shropshire and Cheshire. The campaign faltered almost immediately. William's network of new castles disrupted supply lines, and his rapid response, accepting the brothers' feigned submission after the fall of Warwick, yet continuing to press northward, shattered the fragile unity of the rebel coalition. Edwin and Morcar were permitted to retain their titles for the moment, but their military credibility was irreparably damaged. Undeterred by these native failures, William shifted to direct Norman administration. In late 1068, he appointed Robert de Comines, a seasoned commander from a family tied to the ducal household in Normandy, as the new Earl of Northumbria. The choice ignored the deep-seated ethnic tensions that such an outsider would provoke. Bishop Adelwin, ever the pragmatist, dispatched urgent warnings in January 1069. A rebel army numbering perhaps 10,000 had mobilized and was converging on Durham. Comines, whether through arrogance or miscalculation, pressed ahead with a force of 500 to 700 men, allegedly, by the way, veterans but woefully insufficient against this larger host. Again, likely the rebels were less than this, but still, apparently, was a great disparity between their forces and the one of the Norman ruler of York. On the night of January the 28th, as Comines' troops quartered in the city, rebels infiltrated the streets, barricaded thoroughfares with overturned carts, and set fire to the bishop's residence where Comines had taken refuge. The Normans were trapped and slaughtered almost to a man. Comyn himself perished in the flames, his screams echoing through the cathedral close. Emboldened by this success, the insurgents turned south to York. The castle's outer defenses crumbled under sustained assault. The castellan, possibly Roger de Bouilly or one of his deputies, and hundreds of garrison troops were cut down in the narrow lanes. Yet the core fortress held, its defenders igniting surrounding buildings to create a firebreak and dispatching riders to summon the king. William's reaction was swift and merciless. Covering the distance from the Midlands in a series of forced marches that exhausted men and horses alike, he descended upon the besiegers like a thunderbolt, giving a massive display of strategic and logistical capacity. The rebels, caught between the castle walls and the royal army, so this citadel being besieged and the rest of the city being more or less at the mercy now of the arriving army, were in fact routed with heavy losses, slain in the fields or hunted through the woodlands. To prevent any recurrence, William ordered the construction of a second motte on the right bank of the Ouse, the precursor to Clifford's Tower, that would, as you know, also be the sea of pretty, disturbing events, and placed it under the command of William Fitz-Osbern, Earl of Hereford, and one of his most reliable lieutenants since the Battle of Valledun in 1047. Fitz-Osbern's subsequent sweeps through the surrounding countryside crushed the remnants of organized resistance, enforcing a tense calm that lasted 5 months. This fragile interlude shattered in August 1069 with the arrival of a formidable Danish fleet. Sweyn II of Denmark, nephew of Knut the Great, and harboring as such legitimate claims to the English throne through his uncle's reign from 1016 to 1035, had been courted by English exiles desperate to salvage Edgar's cause. Recognizing the Athelings' movement as moribund, they offered Sweyn the crown outright. Though reluctant to commit his full resources, Sweyn dispatched a powerful expedition under his son Canute, Harald, and Björn, accompanied by his brother Asbjörn and a host of Danish magnates. The armada estimated at between 240 and 300 longships, a force comparable to Harald Hardrada's ill-fated venture 3 years earlier, but not less threatening, carried thousands of seasoned warriors, in fact. They tested southern defenses with probing landings at Dover itself, repulsed by Odo of Bayeux's garrison, interestingly enough, Sandwich, Ipswich, and Norwich before anchoring in the sheltered waters of the Humber estuary in late summer, as many other Norse predecessors had done when heading for British plunder. There they merged with local contingents mustered by Edgar Cospatrick and Waltheof, Earl of Huntingdon, swelling their numbers to perhaps 8 or 10,000. That was a solid logistical base. The Allied host marched on York in September. The Norman commanders within the city's dual castles, William Mallet overseeing both, faced an impossible situation. Outnumbered and with no hope of immediate relief, they set fire to the suburbs to deny the attackers cover, then sortied in desperate counterattacks. These forays proved suicidal. Waltheof, a giant of a man wielding a double-headed axe, reportedly felled dozens of Normans at the gates in a display of martial prowess that entered local legion. The castles fell, marking the heaviest defeat the Normans had suffered on English soil. Yet victory slipped through the Allies' fingers once again. Disputes over plunder and strategy fractured the coalition. Politics, as always, is what determines whether you're going to be military successful. And at the first rumors of William's approach, the Danes and English dispersed into the marshes, repeatedly evading pitched battle, which was also something wise to do, however, expression of a failure. The Danish incursion ignited revolts across the kingdom. In the West Country, Exeter under Gutha, Harold Godwinson's mother, held out for 18 days in 1068 before surrendering to a royal siege. In the Fenlands, isolated thanes harassed Norman supply lines because, as you know, it's very marshy and their, at least guerrilla, works fairly well, so amphibiously speaking, in that those areas are very also Norse influence. Most dangerously, in Herefordshire, Edric the Wild, a tenacious Anglo-Saxon landowner who had maintained semi-independence through alliances with Welsh princes, launched a series of devastating raids that carried as far as the Severn, burning manors and driving off livestock. William delegated containment of these western flare-ups to trusted subordinates like Robert de Mortain and Robert d'O, who shadowed the Danes along the Humber, while he personally led a column to crush the insurgents, massing at Stafford in late November 1069. From there, he pushed into the Lindsey region of Lincolnshire, systematically dismantling rebel networks. En route to York, William encountered a significant obstacle at the River Ayr, whose waters had swollen with autumn rains and whose bridge had been deliberately destroyed by retreating rebels. For 3 weeks, his army was pinned downstream, vulnerable to harassment from archers on the far bank. Scouts eventually located a ford upstream, and under covering fire from crossbowmen, made a video about Frankish crossbowmen of the 11th century, the Normans crossed in good order. Rather than launch a direct assault on York, William repeated the strategy that had broken London's resistance in 1066. He ordered the systematic devastation of a broad belt of territory to the north and west of the city, aiming to isolate it from supplies and reinforcements. Crops were torched in the fields, granaries emptied and burned, livestock driven off or slaughtered. The Danes, their lines of provisions severed, retreated to their ships in the Humber marshes. William negotiated a settlement paying a substantial danegeld, perhaps as much as 4,000 marks of silver, and granting them permission to winter in the estuary before departing in the spring. While the immediate Danish threat neutralized, William turned to the eradication of native resistance in Northumbria. And you know how that looks. He spent Christmas in 1069 in the blackened ruins of York, pointedly donning his crown amid the ashes in a ritual assertion of royal authority. Like a phoenix. In January 1070, he divided his forces into smaller, highly mobile columns that fanned out across the countryside like the fingers of a predatory hand. Their orders were explicit. Burn every village, slaughter every inhabitant who resisted, destroy all food stores, tools, and livestock. I don't know if you have an idea of what this means for, especially in the 11th century, probably pre-industrial agricultural system, right? This is essentially like a massive starvation incoming as a retaliation, right? Plunder the extraction of every possible resources from heroes as a mean to satisfy William's followers. From the Humber to the Tees, the land was laid waste with a thoroughness that shocked even hardened contemporaries. And as we've seen, it's not like the Anglo-Danes, the Vikings, etc., had any, particularly pronounced inclination for such trivial things like human mercy. Well, the Normans show there that the greater the civilization, the greater the destruction feasible. And in this case, it was actually for the broader success of the Kingdom of England to stabilize a great deal through this affirmation of the South on the North. Entire settlements vanished in pillars of smoke. Survivors who escaped the initial massacres faced a merciless winter without shelter or sustenance. The chronicler Florence of Worcester, writing in the early 12th century, described how the king gave free rein to his resentment, spending the entire season laying waste to the country, slaughtering the inhabitants, and inflicting every sort of evil without cessation. Naturally, imagine it in the perspective of the era. You had these guys that had rebelled multiple times after having been given multiple choices, there is not really much of an excuse for that. If you don't stop, and if this is going to continue, I'm simply going to destroy you physically. And who the hell cares about you? I mean, objectively, this is a very coldly calculated and rationally intelligent way to deal with this threat. Simeon of Durham, compiling his history around the same time, painted an even grimmer picture of famine so severe that men, women, and children were reduced to devouring human flesh, horses, dogs, cats, and anything else custom aboard. Others sold themselves into perpetual slavery simply to stave off starvation for one more day. Right? Slavery was sort of gradually evaporating from the more civilized parts of Europe. There were other forms of sort of personal relation, land exploitation, and so on. But Northern Europe witnessed still a great deal of this, and naturally the further sort of devastations on this region did not really help. As a matter of fact, refugees streamed southward in ragged columns, some reaching as far as the monasteries of Worcestershire, where the Evesham chronicler recorded their arrival as living spectres begging for alms. Others crossed into the Scottish lowlands, swelling the courts of Malcolm III and Margaret. By the time William's columns reached the banks of the River Tees, the backbone of Anglo-Danish resistance had been shattered, to say the least. Wealhtheof, the heroic axeman of the York siege, and Cospatrick, the opportunistic earl, rode in to offer submission, their retainers gaunt and demoralized. William accepted their homage but stripped them of real power, retaining Wealhtheof briefly as a figurehead before his later execution for complicity in the 1075 revolt of the Earls. Right, revenge is dish best served cold. Pressing onward into Cheshire, William confronted the last organized pocket of Mercian defiance. These were, again, people who had historically also accepted, for example, the Saxon preeminence, not so happily, but that had been willing to sort of consolidate a kingdom of the English, and they had, say, refused, however, to instead submit to the Normans. Remnants of the forces Edwin had rallied after Stafford in particular. His army, though exhausted after months of continuous campaigning and on the verge of mutiny, as a matter of fact, also because there wasn't too much to squeeze out of this anymore, arrived before the rebels could fully mobilize anyway, thus conferring the Normans a crushing advantage. There was no grand battle as a consequence, only a series of encirclements and negotiated surrenders as local leaders recognized the futility of further resistance. The Mercians were a bit more civilized, they had sort of more to lose, and in general, this uprising had failed, like showing that it's not that there wasn't much that could, at that point, threaten Norman dominance, especially much closer to the Norman power bases. To secure these gains, William ordered the construction of new castles at Chester, perched on the bluffs overlooking the River Dee, and at Stafford, anchoring the Midlands approaches. By Easter 1070, he had returned to Salisbury, where he ceremonially discharged his veterans and began the long process of consolidating Norman rule. The scale of the devastation only became fully apparent 17 years later, when the Domesday Book, compiled in 1086, provided, at least apparent to us now, a meticulous audit of the kingdom's resources. In Yorkshire, the entries are a litany of desolation. Manor after manor marked vastatas est, or hoc est vast, that is to say, it's being wasted, all right? Fully 60% of all holdings lay unproductive. 66% of villages contain at least one wasted manor. As you know, the Domesday Book is extremely detailed. It's de facto proto-cadastre, right? Based, by the way, on earlier Anglo-Saxon administrative practices that we've seen were quite advanced. Well, of course, the Normans made good use of that too. Even the most prosperous districts had seen their taxable value plummet by 60% since 1066. The survey recorded a mere 25% of the pre-conquest population, and plough themes remaining, with documented losses of 80,000 oxen and perhaps 150,000 people. Right? Figures that suggest a depopulation rate as high as 3/4 when accounting for death, flight, and unreported refugees. So we're talking about an unprecedentedly vast devastation. This is probably something that Britain had not witnessed since Caracalla's destruction of the Caledonians, that literally were cancelled as a people for the Picts to emerge a couple of generations later in their stead. Naturally, of course, like, these places kept being populated. Many people had probably fled, right? But not to return immediately. So we understand that many of them were also actually dead, who had been killed. They had starved to death during the Norman campaigns, which is exactly what William had intended to inflict on this population. Individual tenants in chief suffered catastrophic declines. The estates of Drogo de la Beurre, so we're talking also about the same Norman lands there, valued at over £550, had shrunk to barely over 90. Hugh, Earl of Chester, saw his holdings fall from £260 to a paltry 10.5, something apocalyptic. Robert, Count of Morton, from £239 to 33. Between 1086 and the early 12th century, the taxable value of Yorkshire land continued to decline, by the way, reflecting the long-term economic collapse of the region. Right? You don't simply reconstruct that. The Normans have properly destructured the local Anglo-Danish society, its very foundations. If you, as we've seen, they destroyed even the agricultural tools. They annihilated everything they could, right? And you would think, but how could they? Well, they knew where to strike, right? It's not like they had industrial means of destruction, but they knew exactly where to strike in order to basically exhaust for good most of this land's resources, reproduction. Independent archaeological evidence corroborates the chronicler's accounts. Across Yorkshire and Durham, more than 200 coin hoards dating to 1069-1071 have been unearthed. Small caches of silver pennies buried in haste by families, also, simple families fleeing the Norman columns. Right? This is something you normally find during late antiquity, the early Middle Ages, because of invasions. Also during the Viking era, these people tried to hide their own treasures so that they could at some point hopefully come back, taking they couldn't simply transport them with them, if not by losing them or even risking their life doing so. The regular grid-like layouts of many villages in the East Riding, with their neatly aligned tofts and crofts, stand in stark contrast to the organic clustered settlements of the Anglo-Saxon period and point to a systematic replanning in the aftermath of the Herring, akin to the planned rural settlements Norman lords later imposed in Ireland and Wales. Much vaster latifundia, right? Large estates. This was the case also, for example, for southern Italy, the conquest of which was much more peaceful, so to say, but the reorganization of land exploitation, ownership, etc. was massive. The Normans were bringing in literally a de facto feudal system of Western Frankish mold that, as you know, historically in Gaul was habituated to just very few people owning practically everything in a very highly stratified society, unlike this parts of Northern Europe. Similar but less comprehensive campaigns of devastation were waged in Cheshire, Shropshire, Derbyshire, and Staffordshire, targeted to neutralize potential Mercian revivals along the Welsh mark. The moral outrage expressed by contemporary writers was profound, which is interesting to the degree, of course, William had been such a great ruler, and the Norman conquest was really foundational for many, also the later probably Anglo-Saxons that sort of entered that that culture, right? But a civilization that is able to be introspective about these things is surely one that can claim moral superiority that other systems wouldn't otherwise quite externate in the same way. This was true also for, I don't know, the massacre of the Jews and the Christians in Jerusalem that were seen as others, also because they weren't quite just like, I don't know, the European Christians or even Jews. That there was something, let's say, understandable about this whole. As you understand, there is actually a military logic. It's like, why would these exterminations even take place? Because the people had supported this. So you can't have an army work like that, a city besieged, if the local populace is against you. It doesn't, you can't do it, right? It's not a system you can't control. Fortunately, we live in a world in which people think that, I don't know, the government is something else and people are, just on their own and or at the same time subjected to it. Nobody really understands like how it works, simply because they don't have a minimal historical, politological, or even not just even sociological, but anthropological understanding. Every community is absolutely responsible for literally everything that happens to them in a way or another. Even if you are being wronged in a conventional sense, that's because there is a past to that, and in a sense you have to cope with it, as harsh as it sounds. Arderic Vitalis, comprising his ecclesiastical history some 50 to 60 years after the events, which were far enough in that sense for expressing some negative judgment, described the herring as William's cruelest act and a stain upon his soul. He recounted how the king stopped at nothing to hunt his enemies, cutting down multitudes, destroying homes and lands, burning crops, herds, tools, and food to ashes, until more than 100,000 perished of starvation. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, in its terse but damning entry, characterized the campaign as, quote, stern beyond measure. Some modern scholars have gone further, labeling the operation even as genocide, which is a nonsensical idea. Also because, again, this stems from the idea that, for example, like a people in the Middle Ages simply eliminate another just by will. And if you think so, you're just completely alienated from how a polity could work at the time and why this stuff was carried out. It's simple nonsense, also because there were lots of Anglo-Saxons that were from the side of William, and so here what kind of sort of identity can you draw to begin with? Like, people normally throwing in the word genocide at everything are some of the most cerebrally underdeveloped that populate the earth on a normal basis, and of course, like, the contemporary whiners have to say, oh my god, this was a genocide because lots of people were killed. And so whoever does that for doesn't matter which reason, it becomes genocide. Of course, like, there isn't an actual responsibility, an active responsibility. If you really want to draw a line there, no, it's just it's genocide. It's so stupid, really. It's so unhistorical and sort of moralistic that I don't think it has any place in proper, in fact, moral and scientific discourse. The deliberate intent to eradicate the material basis of a rebellion is not, by definition, what genocide is, as a matter of fact. Other scholars emphasize also the intrinsic limitation for even enacting anything of that kind by SCIP to begin with. And these are better scholars that concentrate not on this BS, but on actual operational capacities. They emphasize, for example, the logistical constraints that William faced. His core field army numbered perhaps 7,000 to 8,000 men, the bulk of them tied down in southern garrisons at castles like Nottingham and Warwick, each holding 300 to 500 troops. Operating in the depths of winter from December to March amid snow and frozen rivers, which was fairly untypical to say the least at the time, the Normans could not have covered the entire region with equal intensity to begin with. Independent raids by the Danes wintering on the Humber and opportunistic forays by Malcolm III's Scots almost certainly amplified the destruction. That's actually the bigger picture because, politics, this unknown thing. And of course, like, the enemies of the Normans had to be poor martyrs and stuff. This is complete, again, nonsense, and let's ban people who reason in the other way. Moreover, the Domesday designation of waste may, in some cases, have reflected fiscal policy. By the way, so it was an administrative term, surely also looking at the some of the problems of the demands that these communities had also after these devastations, but in this sense also in a positive direction. For example, some lands, wasted lands, quote unquote, were deliberately left untaxed to encourage repopulation. I mean, it didn't make sense for the Normans to simply destroy, to think that large land could not come to be reorganized under a more sort of framed Norman regime, right? May also indicate simple ignorance on the part of the commissioners who struggled to assess war-torn districts. Politically, the herring enabled a wholesale replacement of the native elite, which is actually the most important thing. The Normans needed Anglo-Danish manpower. Thus, if you decapitate the elites, you can actually come to rule over the bases without even too many devastation. Of course, the elites, as we explained, are backed by the local populations to a degree. As long as the system holds, you have to inflict damage on the population as well. Walker, a cleric from Lotharingia who had already been installed as Bishop of Durham, the first non-Englishman to hold that see, by the way, as Earl of Northumberland, merging ecclesiastical and secular authority to tighten control over church lands. This is a good example. By 1076, virtually every Anglo-Danish magnate north of the Trent had been dispossessed, their estates redistributed to Norman and Breton followers. Also Flemish, the Lotharingians were that, essentially, at least in part. A notable exception was Alan Rufus, a trusted Breton kingsman of William, who received an immense fiefdom in northern Yorkshire, encompassing over 200,000 acres and organized as the Honour of Richmond. Right, this was naturally a trustee of William, and his quasi-principality recorded in the Domesday as the, quote, hundred of the land of Count Alan, functioned almost autonomously. The king retained only the manor of Enderby steeple on its eastern fringe, while Robert of Mortain held a single village to the south. Right, we'll talk more about the Bretons. This name Alan, for example, it's something which we've seen also in the videos about the actual Alani of the migration here, and there is some studies suggesting the Breton cavalry had somehow to do in part in its development with this older migration era steppe people. In any case, like Western Frankish cavalry was heavier, but it had a great impact in particular. The Bretons had a great impact in particular in the development of Norman cavalry, that in the lower Seine River, when the Norse had settled, wasn't that developed compared to the rest of the Western Franks, even the Bretons that were not Frankish, that were not even the Romans, but Celtic. Alan, by the way, excluded other Norman lords, but retained many surviving Anglo-Danish tenants or their heirs, governing through a blend of Breton custom and local law as well. So this shows that while capillary in many regions, the eradication of the Anglo-Danish elites wasn't total, and there wasn't an actual absolute aversion to them in an identitary sense. If we're not talking about all the Anglo-Danish women that were married, by the way, after the death of their husbands in battle at the hands probably of the Normans, in all sense, right? Alan's patronage extended to York, where he founded St. Mary's Abbey in 1088, endowing it richly. By 1086, Alan ranked among the wealthiest men in England, obviously by these indicators, his annual income rivaling that of the greatest earls. One of the diplomatic front, Malcolm III's marriage to Edgar Atheling's sister Margaret in 1071 transformed the Scottish court, introducing Anglo-Saxon liturgical practices and scholarly traditions that would profoundly influence the lowland kingdom. This, as we've seen, had already been the case, but now with all those Anglo-Danish refugees being stiffened further. It also provided Malcolm with a pretext for cross-border raids, which it justified as defending his brother-in-law's rights. So in other words, like they could keep sort of infesting the north with this would go on for a long time. And there was a very interesting military history of this, and the notion is I'm just helping these guys recover what was theirs. William countered with a preemptive campaign in 1072, by the way, marching deep into Lothian and forcing Malcolm to negotiate the Treaty of Abernethy. This, again, shows once again how powerful the Normans were, how the Anglo-Saxons had already been, in any case, towards Scotland. Now the Normans grafted on them and supported by them at the end of the day, being ever more powerful with their continental possessions and other knights that were swarming already. That's, there were Norman knights in Britain way before William's conquest. But as you know, now there were so many different opportunities all across. I made a video about the Earldom of Ulster, if you're interested also in Irish history and the broader Celtic fringe here. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the Scottish king became William's vassal at that point, surrendered hostages, including his son Duncan, and expelled Edgar from his court. Edgar himself submitted to William 2 years later, receiving a pension and a place at the royal court, effectively ending any viable Wessex claim to the throne. Lingering resentment flared again in 1080 when Northumbrian nobles, incensed by Walker's heavy taxation and perceived favoritism towards his Lotharingian entourage, which was definitely a thing, lured him to a parley at Gateshead and hacked him to death. Just again, for sort of telling about the general sentiments involved. William responded by dispatching his half-brother Odo, Earl of Kent, among his other titles, with a punitive expedition that ravaged the countryside north of the Tees, plundered Durham Cathedral's treasury, including a priceless sapphire-encrusted crozier, and drove many local leaders into exile in Scotland or Flanders, by the way. Defensively, the Normans multiplied their strongholds. The Great Motte at Richmond began in 1071, rose 100 feet above the River Swale, its stone keep added later dominating the gorge and blocking Scottish invasion routes. Tick Hill guarded the Don crossings. Pontefract, Wakefield, and Conisbrough formed a defensive arc protecting the central Vale of York, while the Lordship of Holderness was reorganized with earthwork fortifications to counter seaborne threats from the North Sea. Considering the Norwegian and Danish attempts at sort of re-enter the British political landscape. Before 1066, no monasteries existed north of Burton-upon-Trent. In the Herring's wake, new foundations sprang up on wasted lands. Selby in 1069, Whitby refounded, and eventually Fountains Abbey in 1132, which grew into one of the wealthiest Cistercian houses in Europe, but there we are already in another era, so to say. The depopulation necessitated active repopulation policies as well. Again, the Normans wanted this land repopulated at some point. Norman lords, desperate for labor to work their devastated estates, offered in fact favorable leases to anyone willing to settle. Flemings, displaced by coastal flooding, always struggling with the sea in the Netherlands. Bretons seeking opportunity, re-entering sort of their original, in fact, Brittonic homeland, so to say. Even loyal English tenants who had escaped the worst of the destruction. The Domesday Book records significant numbers of sokemanni, or free peasants, in Yorkshire, indicating that not all pre-conquest social structures, for example, had been obliterated. Unlike the wholesale colonization of the Viking Age, the Normans settled primarily at the apex of society, leaving an Anglo-Scandinavian substratum intact beneath them. regardless of, again, the enormous losses that were never sort of the majority that were destroyed. This continuity is evident, obviously, and just natural if you have any idea of how, again, pre-industrial societies worked, especially in persistence of pre-conquest personal names, such as Thorsten, Svein, Ulf. They're typically Scandinavian, in charters dated to the late 11th century through the 13th, by the way, in the vigorous northern tradition of Middle English literature, exemplified by the alliterative revival of the 14th century, that, again, is a bit of a distant reflourishing, but somehow connected with the peculiarity, if anything, of this particular English region. And in the relative scarcity of French place name replacements compared to the south, where, you have plenty of them, where villages like, in fact, Beaumont or Montfort proliferated. From the Norman perspective, the herring of the north achieved its strategic objectives with brutal efficiency. There was much to be proud of from a Norman standpoint in carrying out not just the formidable expedition, the landing, the strategic approach to the army of Harold Godwinson, its defeat in open field, but also, and to a degree especially, in the final settlement of British domination. The destruction of local rebellions, the teaching. This wasn't much a matter of destruction as an end of itself, to itself, as we've seen. It was properly a deliberate, shock, traumatic strategy to completely destroy any Anglo-Danish thought of rebellion. Paid being destroyed in, again, the most physical ways instead. And it worked. It worked pretty darn well, right? In great part of the foundation of the Kingdom of England as one of the most prosperous and solid institutions in high medieval Europe, as much as the later development of the English state, like the English history, owe much to this earlier settlement. Like, it's, the worst at the beginning, and then, you can't really do something. Like, the Normans, we'll talk this better also in other videos, had a completely sort of, that's not much just merciless mentality in here, but they properly considered England as a prize of war. Right? This wasn't something that they had inherited, they had been given in fief, like, Normandy itself from the Western Frankish king. This was properly a personal possession. William had conquered this place and therefore could do with it whatever the hell he wanted, right? And regardless of the obvious continuity of Anglo-Saxon identity, to say the least, and also properly of institutions and administrative structures, that order that we know of later stemmed from this very solid granitic, like monarchic mentality imported by the Normans, with an incredibly advanced vassalatic beneficence system. We've seen here the fortification of Britain, the integration, the full, in fact, absorption of Britain in the great continental civilization, that whether, Brexiters like it or not, is the most intimate foundation of English identity. And in a very rewardingly, let's say, to be proud of, right? A really character feature of one's country. It would be too long, but today's video, of course, is here we're about to finish this. But that's also why I would like to make more medieval, and in general also just general English history videos to explain what English tradition is also substantiated by, right? The early relations with the continent. You would argue, of course, the airing of the North was a terrible thing, right? And so there is nothing to celebrate from an Anglo-Saxon perspective in those moments, etc. But Anglo-Saxon history had already been, first of all, one of conquest, right? Britain. So they actually did their own share of stuff. When you look at the Anglo-Danish, you realize that those same Danish had done the same exact thing to Britain. When you look, by the way, at the previous inhabitants, there had also been particularly productive. The Celts, as we've seen, didn't lose any opportunity to sort of to infest the Anglo-Saxon world, by the way, without much of a broader sort of chance of even thinking, now we will get rid of the Anglo-Saxons. It was mostly trying to survive from their side and sort of create as much, to delay as much as possible this process of Anglo-Saxon reinforcement. But in particular, Anglo-Saxon identity was substantiated in a dramatically intense fashion by the historical affirmation just of their own kingdom in a unitary sense. At the expense, Anglo-Saxons had been fighting against one another, uniting themselves into a kingdom of the English. But also they had properly affirmed themselves as such through a massive continental influence. I mean, the Anglo-Saxon conversion to Christianity was also, was not just mediated by the Franks, but the relations between England and Rome were in that sense incredibly old and sort of fixed a lot also as far as, let's say, for example, the reaffirmation of the English church over the same Celtic fringe that had been actually evangelized before before England, but was, of course, Britain also, the areas that would become England had been previously Christian. But aside from that, there is a protagonistic view in that. Things had deteriorated, as a matter of fact, in the higher Middle Ages after the Danes had settled. Then the Viking world had shattered this young and, you can't say really fragile monarchy, because, again, the English substratum was not just capable of absorbing the blow, in any case was the most advanced part, and it was reuniting in some ways. You can't just imagine what would have happened at this point in history in particular had, I don't know, the Anglo-Danes won at Hastings. Surely there would have been some positive development, and God only knows what this would have meant historically in a general sense, how England would have developed. But at the same time, there is no doubt that the Normans brought in they stepped up, probably the Anglo-Danes did participate in the Norse government and establishment, but they also were able to, at the end of the day, remain English in an English land that will identify as such later on. So it will take a long time before the English monarchs will stop speaking French as their first language. There is all a history of abuse, of torment, of destruction. As you've seen, the herring of the North is quite sort of macroscopically terrible and self-evident in that regard. However, all in all, it also contributed to the establishment of a more compact country, a more robust feudal monarchy, something that went on developing, by the way, autonomously, great part of what today we consider, in a more modern sense, also English, low-tempered by the relation with a specific institution, right? The English sort of exception, so to say, owes much to the Norman conquest. You would say how, if we express simply an Anglo-Saxon natural law, right? The God-given law, natural identity. How does a monarchy come into play? Naturally, the English had problems later in history with the concept of the monarchy. Paradoxically, they are still a monarchy, but as you know, in the 17th century, something very dark happened, and from there was also a sort of demonization of monarchy as some sort of tyranny, and or at least as the state as some this perennially, tendentially tyrannical system, etc., which is not as a continental European you can't relate to when we think about what happened throughout our own history compared to Britain or the United States and their sort of affiliation, so to say, from the Anglo-Saxon matrix. But at the same time, this is a strictly historical judgment. An idea that, in that sense, Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism was unknown to the rest of Europe, and that therefore that was something uniquely different about England from quite a while. There's surely something that every country has uniquely different from the other, and surely, as I was saying before, there is a very Anglo-Saxon way to the principle of customary law, of that sort of medieval sense of national identity, that again could be that is already perhaps too big of a word of a term, but let's say all countries at the time had common law. Like all countries, there may other countries, for example, that had a much more gradual development of monarchy, the same Scandinavians, for example. And that, first of all, was not a positive thing for them, because it just mirrored some a scarcer development, greater sort of instability, and again, all what was both cause and consequence of that also before. And in general, like the process, for example, of the spread of civil law, the distinction from common law, it's something that happened mostly from the most developed areas of Europe in a way that was consensual, that was treated still as a kind of common law. Right? In fact, civil law is actually treating Roman law as common law, as a matter of fact, and for reasons that were embraced a bit by everybody, like in Europe, including lands of Germanic tradition. So, in this sense, the relation with the monarchy, the same concept of Bouvines, right, and the Magna Carta, as especially the latter being, again, this exceptional thing that happened in English history. Actually, if you look at it in historical perspective, it's something very normal, and that at the time undermined English power. And the countries of war was not just the outcome and the defeat, but a further disintegration of public authority that definitely did not help the development of the Kingdom of England, that at some point also in the later Middle Ages starts lagging behind, once again, compared to continental development in the Renaissance, for example. So it's actually a very complicated story, and it's interesting and fascinating when you actually get it, because this is not a criticism to Anglo-Saxon culture, quite the contrary. Actually, it's quite amazing to see a culture like this, and how and why historically features like the exceptional ones of Anglo-Saxon culture that so much succeeded in history as a civilization, as an identity, right, were forged by actually a very accidented path, and definitely not a linear one of, continuous improvement, and also progress, like the stuff came out of nowhere, because it was like that since the very beginning, right? People would like to understand, but they have no things like this, but they have no clue about essentially what the history of civilization, of countries, of law, of institutions, of politics really is. And it's really unfortunate that we don't teach this stuff more thoroughly. I try with Schwerpunkt to present this perspective, and that's why, again, we have a pretty variegated sort of medieval English playlist by now. However, it feels a bit unsystematic. We have to look at this way more systematically to explain this convoluted, but at the end of the day, overall successful already throughout the medieval arc, history effect of English identity, culture, and more. I wanted just to check how many British history video, medieval Britain, let's say better. Medieval Britain and Ireland, 90, so this is 91. Well, all right, well, overall, that's not so bad. In the broader picture, just we have to do tiny bit more, right? And we add the hiring of the North to this series, and I hope that at this point we're really getting something rightly done. We have medieval British warfare playlist with 43 videos, right? And let's get to 100 to claim we have even something satisfactory. For today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.